Fighting for Faith and Nation, Dialogues with Sikh Militants, by Cynthia Kepply Mahmood. Introduction. This book is the result of a difficult project that could not have been undertaken without the guidance, generosity, tolerance, and trust of a great many people. First to be mentioned must be the Khalistani Sikh community, whose members put themselves at risk by welcoming an inquisitive stranger. The hospitality of countless Sikh households and gurudwaras made the interviews on which this research is based possible, and many individuals spent hours and days away from their homes and their work to answer my endless questions. In particular, I appreciate the grace with which militant Sikhs have greeted my disagreements with them, and encouraged me to put these divergent opinions in speeches and writings. This generosity of spirit and sense of respect for difference will be, I hope, the enduring cornerstone of the Sikh community. With regard to the Sikhs, I want to make a few things perfectly clear at the outset, though they will be made clear throughout the book as well. First, the Khalistani militants form a very small subset of the Sikh community as a whole. This book is not about the Sikhs. It is about the militants. Any attempt to treat what is written here as a generalization about Sikhs in general, would be highly misguided, and I would condemn it wholeheartedly. The book is not even about all of those Sikhs who support the idea of an independent homeland. It focuses specifically on those who have taken up arms in order to achieve it, and on the communities that support them. 3 years of intermittent fieldwork with expatriate Sikhs in 10 North American cities, forms the basis for this book, which is both an oral history of the militant movement, and a dialogical ethnography of a cultural community. Some of the people with whom I worked are permanent residents or citizens of the United States or Canada, others are here as recent refugees, and still others live outside of North America, but met me in various locations for the purpose of recording their narratives. The tapes on which they were recorded have been destroyed, and for the protection of my interlocutors, no record of names, places, or other identifying information has been preserved. Though I cross-checked most of what was told to me with other sources, I cannot vouch for the veracity or accuracy of every episode reported to me by Sikh militants. There will obviously be divergent accounts of many of these, particularly from their enemies. The portrait of militancy in this book is therefore not an objective or balanced description of the Punjab conflict. It is a glimpse into the world of Sikh militants as I have experienced it. I will welcome the broader contextualization of this work by other scholars. The story of my research on Sikh militancy is also a story about my personal confrontation with violence. To mask it here as more neutral, more distanced than it is, would be to deny the nights of terror, displaced to another, safer venue, that I experienced off and on, since I began this project. And to write about Sikh militants as if I had not become personally, existentially entangled with them and their quest, would be an inexcusable hypocrisy. As a scholar, I know what it means to look for all sides of a question, to be critical of sources, to be objective. As an anthropologist, I am familiar with the peculiar inside-outside stance of the ethnographer, which allows glimpses into other realities, while retaining a quintessentially Western academic outlook. In trying to understand what militant Sikhs are doing, however, I find that the anthropology of another era is also useful, not the anthropology claiming to be science, but the one that sees the confrontation of man with man in all his naked mystery as the heart of the anthropological enterprise. Like many anthropologists of my generation, I find myself questioning some of the basic axioms of my field, which, however stimulating intellectually, seem somehow inadequate to the task of understanding real human beings. Immanuel Kant, a forgotten ancestor of contemporary anthropology, took the traditional, "What is man?" question to be the heart of what an academic discipline of anthropology should be. But for Kant, this question subsumed 3 subsidiary issues that have been largely ignored. What can I know? What ought I to do, and what may I hope? It is this last query in particular that is rather jarringly out of place in the modern academic climate, though Edward Burnett Tylor too, author of our classic 1871 definition of culture, emphasized not only the habits of human beings, but their capabilities as well. Is it not part of the anthropologist's enterprise, to ask what heights humans are capable of reaching? Our discipline's insistence on the value of the everyday, so important in countering neglect of the ordinary in other areas of scholarship, also has the effect of somewhat eclipsing the reality of the out of the ordinary, the truly heroic, in human endeavor. Taken as a whole, the picture painted of humankind by the collections of ethnographic literature, many of us have on our bookshelves, is sadly inadequate. True, most human beings live quotidian, habituated, ordinary lives most of the time. But what about when they don't? What are people capable of when the everyday is disrupted by famine, by war, or pestilence, when they are called upon to do more than fetch water and grow crops, and make love and rear children, to be more than just human? Our literature doesn't contain many portraits of people in extraordinary, rather than ordinary, circumstances. Sikh militants in the northwestern state of Punjab in India, have been engaged in an armed insurgency for the past decade and a half. Their ultimate aim is the formation of a sovereign nation of Khalistan, land of the pure. It is not clear what percentage these militants and their supporters form of the total Sikh population. There are many others who would like to see an independent nation emerge, but reject violence as a means of achieving it, and still others who are firmly loyal to India, and reject the Khalistani ideology outright. Conditions in Punjab have been so disrupted by violence, on the part of both the militants and the government forces arrayed against them, and the exchange of ideas has been so severely curtailed by various forms of censorship, that assessing accurately what the people there really want, is probably impossible. What is clear is that tens of thousands of people, militants, government troops, and bystanders, have been killed in the past 15 years or so of the conflict. This level of violence is equivalent to that of many of the so-called low-intensity conflicts that dot the global landscape today, and places most members of the Sikh community in what we might well call extraordinary circumstances. Certainly the Khalistani militants, now scattered in exile across several continents, live their lives at an emotional pitch, far from the everyday reality of most of the people we know and study. Anybody who has thought about whether the Nicaraguan Contras were freedom fighters or counter-revolutionaries, or whether the PLO is a terrorist or nationalist organization, will recognize the element of relativism that comes into any serious discussion of political conflicts like the one in Punjab. Unfortunately, the rather obvious fact that things look different from the inside of one of these groups than from the outside, has been lost on many people involved in policy making and negotiation, who tend to underestimate the radical differences in worldview that obtain between the U.S. State Department, for example, and militant Islamists intent on blowing up the World Trade Center. The fact is, we don't know enough about how the latter think to effectively talk with them. We can't easily imagine what the world looks like from extraordinary viewpoints. And ethnographies of village life in Egypt, however important in themselves, don't enlighten us much about World Trade Center bombers. There is a growing feeling among younger anthropologists, that our discipline has suffered a not entirely unwarranted marginalization, over the past few decades. Even as the methods and language of ethnography are being taken up by colleagues in fields as diverse as political science and English literature, and even as cultural studies usurps anthropology's primary concept of culture, the discipline itself cannot be said to be a central voice on the current intellectual scene. It is particularly worrisome that anthropologists are called on as infrequently as they are in the policy arena, which depends on accurate information and assessment of actors, whose worldviews may be wildly different from our own. In a culturally plural world, those whose calling is translation across cultural divides, have a critical role to play. Dr. Amarjit Singh, an advocate for Khalistan, and another gentleman took me to the San Pedro detention facility in Los Angeles Harbor, where several dozen Sikhs were imprisoned for immigration offenses. That was the first of a series of encounters with Sikhs, varying in content and form, but always quite intense, that forms the basis of this book. Over the course of the next 3 years, I interviewed dozens of militants at length, stayed in the homes of militant families, spoke in Sikh gurudwaras, and attended Sikh conventions. That first trip to San Pedro, nonetheless remains crystal clear in my mind, for it was then that I really committed to the idea of writing a book about Sikh militancy. Once I realized that I would indeed be talking with people involved on both receiving and initiating ends of acts of violence, I thought carefully about how best to protect both them and me from legal repercussions. Anthropological field notes can be subpoenaed, a fact some have learned to the detriment of their informants. I first developed an informed consent statement, which I read or told to people at the outset of interviews, which stated that I had no legal privilege, and that information told to me could be requested by a court of law. Because of this, I asked Sikhs with whom I talked to change names, places, and details as necessary to disguise their stories. I knew I needed to remain in ignorance of certain things, despite the problems it might cause my research, because otherwise I might become inescapably compromised. For example, finding out who committed an unsolved crime. I believe, however, that for the purposes of anthropology, as opposed to, for example, the purposes of intelligence gathering, it is in some sense not the concrete details in which we are interested. Was it in Gurdaspur or Ludhiana that the bomb went off? Was it in this jail or that jail that the roller was used? These are not the kind of things I wanted to learn from militant Sikhs. What I did want to learn about was how it felt to be somebody whose legs have been permanently crippled by torture, or alternatively, somebody who set off a bomb. Often, not surprisingly, the two are related. And the trust the Sikhs extended to me was reciprocated by an important trust I had to extend to them, to protect me from becoming compromised by unwanted information. I did not want to become a Khalistani, I wanted to remain an anthropologist, and I had to have help from my interlocutors, to retain this fragile inside-outside position. The wristbands worn by Sikhs, the kara, represent many things. I got one at a Gurudwara near Chicago at one point, and I sometimes wear it and other times take it off. I find myself taking it off, when I am feeling too much in danger of going native, through my close association with the people I study, too much the participant, too little the observer. But I always wear it when I write, and for me that clink of steel around my wrist, serves as a constant reminder of two values. First is the commitment to write the truth as I, in my best effort, understand it. Truth is pure steel, says the founder of Sikhism, Guru Nanak. But in another way, the Kara reminds me of my indissoluble link to real people in the real world, more generally, the impact of what I do as a scholar, on the world outside the academy. We are too easily oblivious to the practical consequences of our work, claiming arrogantly that truth is truth, we will write it as we see it, and let the chips fall where they may. I am too much of a pragmatist to ever be that kind of scholar. I know that what I do affects real people, and I have to try to think through the possible repercussions. Another aphorism of the Sikhs comes to mind: truth is the highest good, they say, but higher still is truthful living. How to reconcile adherence to truth with commitment to human beings is, of course, one of the big challenges facing concerned scholars today. It is also one with which Sikhism as a philosophical tradition has grappled extensively. Maybe we can learn something from them, and they from us. Confronting violence. In this spirit, I began interviewing men and women involved in the armed side of the Khalistan conflict, renegotiating my stance as independent scholar, yet constrained by politics at every step. There were missteps too. But in bumbling my way into the lives of people in conflict, I found myself personally engaged in a way that I had not foreseen, not on a political level, but on a deeply philosophical one, what Nordstrom and Robin call existential, rather than cultural shock. I had never really sat down and talked with people who openly accepted the necessity of dying and killing for a cause, and who were ready to do either at the drop of a hat. Being around people like this makes you think, and not only about the viability of the state of India. For what am I willing to die, and to kill? And aside from this nearly automatic reflexive impulse, What does it mean to live in a community circumscribed by violence, to witness lives in which violence, and the threat of violence, and the memory of violence, weave a sinuous path through daily activities, and define a world in which survival alone seems a substantial accomplishment? At the tail end of a generation whose attitudes were largely shaped by the Vietnam War, looming over our consciousness even decades later, I was always generally opposed to military action. Gulf War, no; Somalia or Bosnia, better give it deep thought, and so on. Unlike my father, I was never a pacifist, couldn't be a pacifist in a world in which the strong so clearly dominated the weak, and so clearly would not give up that power by moral pressure alone. One thing was clear, however: violence was a last resort, at best an unfortunate strategic necessity, in a world in which power was distributed unequally. One might have to grit one's teeth, go against one's better instincts, and make short-term sacrifices in the interests of long-term justice. The idea that violent actions could be meaningful in themselves was a troubling one, all too glibly avoided in mainstream Western circles. At the same time, in the 60s and 70s, there was a new academic literature that tried to define aggression as an inherent part of human nature. Books like Konrad Lorenz's On Aggression, Robert Ardrey's Territorial Imperative, and Lionel Tiger's Men in Groups had great popular appeal, because they seemed to live up to widespread ideals of peace, while also neatly justifying capitalism, patriarchy, and other aspects of modern Western society. Most anthropologists hated this kind of literature, and devoted much teaching time to demonstrating that humans were not genetically wired for violence. There were various harmless peoples to be found around the globe. Look at those Semite, for example, who had such an abhorrence of violence, they would not tolerate even a parent reprimanding a child. Yet oddly enough, Robert Denton, one of the key ethnographers of the Semite, noted that when Semite were recruited into the Malaysian army, they became fantastic soldiers, experiencing a blood drunkenness in battle that horrified onlookers. The Kalahari San turned out to occasionally murder each other, fought with valor in the South African Defence Force, and later joined the guerrilla organization, SWAPO, in some numbers when they realized where their interests lay. The picture turned out to be complex. Every society seemed to exhibit both peaceful and violent behavior, however various the interpretations placed upon them. We are all capable of violence, is one of those truisms that seems to be, in fact, true, at least as far as societies as wholes are concerned. Outside the halls of academia, the most important forums where matters of human violence are discussed, are the military headquarters of the world. Pragmatists all, military writers are rarely inclined to speculate about whether we are instinctually aggressive, or simply culturally inclined or disinclined to violence. They are interested in one question only: given war, how can we, whoever the we is, win it? Yet despite their pragmatic stance, much of the work by military theorists is oddly abstract, talking in coldly rationalistic terms, that seem eerily to exclude breathing human beings. Classical military theory is therefore as inadequate to the task of understanding actual violence, as the socio-biological literature that reduces it to genetics, and the cultural literature that makes it epiphenomenal to social circumstance. Working with Sikh militants has made clear to me that abstract explanations of group violence, that neglect the highly individualized quality of participation in violent activities, whether on the part of victims or perpetrators, are insufficient. Wars are fought between groups, but pain, death, and risk are deeply personal. Treating people's actual experiences of violence as central, gives a wholly different perspective from that of military theory, and it brings to life Corbyn's insight, that human violence is mostly conceptual, not instinctual, emotional, customary, or blind. Sikhs, drawing on an elaborate theology of violence, are particularly articulate about the conceptual order behind their armed resistance, an order fully ensconced in individual, conscious, decision-making human beings. Anyone who attempted to understand Sikh militancy or predict militant actions, based on the hyper-rationalized military theory of ROTC textbooks, would find themselves wholly out of their element, as in another arena, the US military establishment also discovered with regard to the Viet Cong. Though many academics would like to see ROTC programs out of the universities, and have little respect for military writers, it is important to look carefully at military theories about violence, because they are spawned by, and in turn shape general attitudes toward political violence in our culture. In particular, the legitimation of murder carried out by states, and the criminalization of murder carried out by non-state groups or by individuals, is a legacy of the Western military tradition that haunts us today, distorting, for example, analyses of the World Trade Center bombing. How can you sit around talking with people who are responsible for murder? I was asked by one student with regard to interviews with Sikh militants. I presume that sitting around talking to war veterans would not provoke the same sense of outrage. To be sure, there are important differences between state and non-state political violence, and glossing over these differences can be both intellectually irresponsible and pragmatically dangerous. Nevertheless, the very strong sense of disjunction between the two, spawned by traditional military theory, continues to inhibit the effective resolution of conflict. Karl von Clausewitz's famous dictum, "War is a continuation of politics by other means," points to a critical feature of the modern military universe, its emphasis on strategy. Many radical leftists have taken over this notion as well, accepting the strategic necessity of violence, without much further consideration of what that violence means to the individuals who engage in it. People in Clausewitz's universe commit acts of violence rationally, because they are part of trained armies that obey orders. It follows from this way of thinking, that the most powerful states with the best trained troops, and the best military strategies will win wars. That this conclusion is in fact patently untrue, is illustrated by the Vietnam case, among others. Martin van Creveld uses the US failure in Vietnam as one of the centerpieces of his sustained critique of Clausewitzian theory, the transformation of war. In this important book, Van Creveld proposes that the low-intensity conflicts now prominent in the world are not a minor variant or modification of state-based warfare, but are, in fact, wars, and that ideas about what warfare is have to shift to accommodate this new reality. In guerrilla conflicts, unlike wars that follow the Clausewitzian model, the state is not the sole legitimator of violence, and people and army, the other two arms of the Trinitarian triangle, are intertwined, even at times identical. Van Creveld also points out that countering guerrilla insurgencies with Clausewitzian strategy nearly always fails. Moreover, the experience of combat itself is quite different for the guerrilla. Indeed, it recaptures some aspects of the kinds of warfare that preceded the establishment of modern nation-states. Personal commitment makes the crucial difference. It is one of the great tabooed facts of our age that men and women who have experienced the heat of battle sometimes feel nostalgia for it. War is hell, we're not supposed to like it, and any hint that there is something attractive about killing and risking death might make us all cross the threshold into World War III and Armageddon. Any realistic perusal of war literature, however, reveals that for all the horror of the battlefield, it creates a special pathos that is for many people not replicable in any other human endeavor. Many veterans, for all their nightmares, view their moments in battle as the high points of their lives. What are we to make of this? To talk about aggressive biological instincts is too reductive, to talk of psychopathology, too trivializing. Most of us would rather not face the fact that coming to grips with death, which is largely what the war experience is one of the existential tasks facing every human being. It is not an entirely unnatural idea to suggest that this confrontation with human mortality is worthy of some kind of celebration, whatever the circumstances under which it occurs. Figuring out how to approach this difficult topic without contributing to a pornography of violence, without glorifying murder, is one of the challenges that face anthropologists trying to write realistically about the human experience of conflict. The question of why violence occurs in the broad sense raises with it, then, the insistent question of how individuals engaged in violence experience that engagement. To say either that they are, in their thousands, just following orders in the rational sense is absurd, so is accusing them all of insanity. Why people fight, why they willingly face death and cause it, is explored historically in John Keegan's excellent Soldier's Eye View of War, The Face of Battle, which compares what battle was like for combatants at Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme. The brave new world not of armies but of peoples, of low-intensity non-state guerrilla struggles, defined less in terms of massed battles than of individual encounters, however, invites more of this kind of ethnography of violence, that draws on real people's experiences of what it feels like to face that fusillade, or pull that trigger. Unless we understand why it makes some kind of sense for somebody to put a bomb in the World Trade Center, we will not be able to prevent this kind of atrocity from happening again. Heightened security measures are more an admission of defeat than a meaningful remedy. Militant Sikhs, suffering and causing pain, loss, and death every day, are living in extraordinary, not ordinary circumstances. Their actions can't give us a window on everyday human life, they are not typical even for Sikhs generally. But to return to Kant's forgotten question for anthropology, what may I hope? I think we can well look to communities under fire like this one, to see just what we human beings are capable of. Dignity in the face of unutterable insults, physical and mental, is part of that equation. Unflinching courage in the face of nearly certain death in combat, is another. Love for one's comrades, generosity toward one's community, devotion to one's God, these are other qualities of Sikh militants that inspire and instruct. These people are magnificent, one of my students commented after hearing some of my stories, and indeed, in an important sense, they are. Obviously, their victims would not agree with this assessment. But this is in fact, the point, they are magnificent, and the havoc they wreak is devastating. We won't understand them better by denying either part of that formula. Seen as a resistance movement, certainly the most heroic light in which to see it, Sikh militancy can be placed along an axis with other respectable resistances, like those of the Tibetans, the Kurds, and even the French in World War II. It is also, however, a movement for the consolidation of the Sikh religion. From the viewpoint of loyalist Sikhs who have no interest in Khalistan, the militants are not only dangerous terrorists, but also fundamentalists who appoint themselves bastions of orthodoxy, from which no deviation is tolerated. There is then, an axis of religious revivalism, along which militant Sikhism must also be placed, less flatteringly for most of us, beside Ayatollah Khomeini, and Jerry Falwell. Mark Juergensmeyer has attempted to reconcile these divergent but intersecting axes, by calling such politicized fundamentalists, religious nationalists, a term probably acceptable to people both within and outside of these movements. The fact is that those scholars may debate, whether the Sikh militant movement is primarily one of resistance or one of fundamentalism, a debate largely revolving around the extent of personal sympathy for the movement. It is clearly both. Militant Sikhism has flourished during the 1980s and 1990s as an obvious reaction to state persecution, but its origins in the 1970s cannot be understood without recourse to the notion of religious consolidation. The two have worked in tandem, to create that volatile mix characteristic of religious nationalist movements. In the Sikh case too, the militancy is marked by a certain unpredictability, that drives those interested in containing it wild, and brings pause to every thoughtful observer. There are too many diverse pressures, and too much of a hothouse atmosphere within the militant community, to make clear predictions about what a future state, led by current militant leaders would be like. This observation brings me, still reflecting on Kant, to a fourth question I would add to his composite query: what is man? In knowing Sikh militants, I have a better sense of what I may hope for man, but I also find myself asking, what must I fear? I don't fear religious nationalism per se, at least not the Sikh kind, but I would not want to write the element of tragedy in the making, out of my meditations here. As the ancient Greeks taught us, the noblest human beings can finish tragically. A movement full of verve and moral right, populated by magnificent human beings, can end up creating a political situation that is an abomination. From the French Revolution on, we've seen this tragedy too many times to be over-optimistic about revolutions. Most of the Sikh militants with whom I speak are sadly, or perhaps happily, unaware of the problematic tendency of revolutionary movements to turn sour. Like revolutionaries everywhere, they are convinced of the uniqueness of their cause, and are in any case too busy fighting, to worry much about outcomes. The struggle for Khalistan is, perhaps, best envisioned as a quest. The process of striving itself provides an important source of meaning. The evocative quality of the Khalistan theme in Sikh rhetoric far exceeds political issues like borders and national flags, and it makes nobility of effort virtually an end in itself. The pervasiveness of this theme also explains why Clausewitzian containment efforts have not in fact dampened Khalistani ardor. It is only partially explicable in terms of rational strategy. Today, when counterinsurgency efforts have in large part succeeded in driving the militant movement underground or overseas, the persistence of a deep commitment to the idea of Khalistan, on the part of Sikh freedom fighters, can only be understood in terms of philosophy, which persists through the ups and downs of politics and battles. To ignore this side of things, is to suppose that once the militants have been sufficiently repressed, the struggle for Khalistan will be over. My experience with Sikh militants strongly indicates that this will not be the case. My task here, then, is to convey the sense of meaningful striving, the sense of being at the peak of one's humanity, in spite of the hellish conditions around one, that animate Sikh militants as they fight and die for a sovereign Sikh nation. The same sense of participation in a holy quest sustains them in exile overseas, as they read reports of the pacification of Punjab, that seem so at odds with their own experience. Despite the probable accusation from some quarters, that I am providing a platform for terrorists, I use the militants' own words where possible, to bring to the reader a sense of the immediacy of the Sikh militant world. It is less distant and more accessible than most people think. The militants are more like us than most people think, and I hope this book will make that clear, while problematizing what they are doing. Though the differences between me and militant Sikhs are vast, aside from myriad cultural differences, they are devoutly religious and I am not. The thing that puts them and me on different sides of an immense divide, is the fact that they are involved in a war, and I am not. Yet I am haunted by the realization, that had I been born in different life circumstances, I might well be the one dodging or throwing that grenade. Like most anthropologists, I am intrigued by lives not lived, attracted to windows into other possibilities. I rejoice in the richness added to my life by my encounter with Sikh militants, while recognizing the disagreements, many extreme, between us. Rupinder Singh Sodhi, the Indian Supreme Court attorney, who defended two Sikhs involved in the assassination of Indira Gandhi, said that his aim was not to get them off in legal terms, but to create a space in which their voices could be heard with dignity. I sometimes see my mission here in similar terms, and like Sodhi, believe that militant Sikhs respect it. I am in the system, I am committed to following the rules, I can't be a partisan who helps insurgents evade the law. Assassins get hanged, they and we know that, and accept it. But we still can benefit from hearing what they have to say. What makes it worthwhile for somebody to face the gallows? A Sikh later hanged for the murder of an Indian Army general, Arun Vaidya, said that he imagined the rope around his neck as a lover's embrace. What sort of worldview does a comment like that spring from? Only recently has greater attention been paid to the actual experiences of ethnographers doing field work, which, more than a set of methods, means reaching out to other human beings across a sometimes immense cultural gulf. That fieldwork is such a momentous personal experience for most anthropologists, has traditionally been belied by our rhetorical style, which conformed to the misguided notion that a pretended distance from one's subjects was prerequisite to science. Now, thankfully, there is more latitude for a range of ways in which ethnographers can viably relate to the people they study and learn from. Jewish theologian Martin Buber talks about the I-thou relationship, as crucial to human nature, the recognition, in the very otherness of the other, and in the wholehearted acceptance of that otherness, of kinship. Those I-thou relationships, impossibly intimate, are at the heart of the anthropological enterprise, whether it concerns Sikh militants or New Guinea tribes people. This is when informant, or even the Naushik interlocutor, are pitifully inadequate terms, friendship too maudlin to capture the ontological embrace of the alien as like oneself, wholly human. The moments of epiphany in field work, are those in which one confronts the anguish and expectation of being human in another, the what must I fear, and what may I hope, we all confront in such very different forms. It is in this space between oneself and another, fraught with meaning, that the ultimate question, what is man, might be answered. When that space is wide, as in the confrontation across cultures, this question can be explored in its fullest exuberant richness. Finally, let me be entirely forthright about my own political stance here, about which readers may be rightfully curious. I am not a supporter of Khalistan. I think the Sikh militants have some serious grievances with the state of India. I abhor many of the methods militants have chosen to address them. Since I am not a Sikh, nor a Punjabi, nor an Indian, I don't have a position on the question of Khalistan, and I feel that the idea of what Khalistan would be, is unclear enough at this point, to make taking such a position inadvisable in any case. I don't think the militants are crazy or evil, however. I don't think India has seen the last of Sikh separatism, and I think that the best way to understand why militants fight, is to talk with them about it. I think that the only way to prevent outbreaks of violence such as Punjab has witnessed over the past 15 years or so, is to ensure human rights and freedoms, including attention to the principle of self-determination. These are my political views, in short. Not all scholars are comfortable with highly sensitive topics such as this one, and some of them are my close colleagues. I therefore thank members of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maine for their tolerance of this work, and I particularly value the guidance and support of Henry Munson throughout the project.